a lot of delegates from Africa, and they're here for the AUB Media Summit on climate change. It's taking place just next door at the Boulevard Hotel. And the main thing that they're talking about is disaster risk and reduction and effective early warning systems for African media. How can people do this whenever they talk about climate change and the mitigating factors and what African media can do to tell the story of Africa? Also happening today is that the Kenya Union of Savings and Credit Cooperatives, KUSCO, is having their meeting today at the NSSF building in Nairobi. So those are some of the stories that we're keeping tabs on. And remember, there are hashtag SportsCheck KBC. So our sign language interpreter is Ann Wangeshi, and getting into conversations around sports. Let me start with the last one. And the last conversation that we are going to have, and this is about something we would call schools cross-country. And the International Schools Federation World Cross Country Championships will be taking place at the Ngong Racecourse on Sunday the 12th of May. It's going to be live on KBC Channel 1. This is the second time it's being hosted on the African continent, and it's over 20 years. The last African country to host these championships was Morocco. So we'll have Robert Ngisire, who is the coach of the Kenya schools team. 3 age grades that we're talking about: 8 to 11, 12 to 14, and the 15 to 17-year-olds. Then also here will be Gikonyo Karaoke, who is the coordinator of the ISF cross country. Then we'll also be having a conversation about a sport round table that's going to be hosted by the Strathmore Business School. And so we've got Khairan Nur, who's a sports lawyer, Richard Wanjoy, who's a data scientist at Strathmore University. What the discussions mainly with that will be taking place on Thursday will be about governance, the whole aspect of sport business. We're also going to be talking about sports law and also how they can leverage on the media in different ways, not just through the telling of the news stories, but also live broadcast. And also remember that there is new media which has changed the entire communication landscape all across the world. So those are the conversations that we'll be having later. But we start with rugby because right now we have got the Super Series back after 10 years. You know, everyone's been waiting. It's something that was there for about 12 years. And the Super Series, where you bring together the best players from various clubs and you create franchises for them. So this year we've got 4, the Lions, the Rhinos, the Cheetahs, and the Buffaloes, and they had their first matches over the weekend at the RFUA grounds. It was a full muddy affair. No, we watched the Lions versus Rhinos game on our sister station 1254. And next stop will be Nakuru. To talk about that is the tournament director, and he's also been a long-time coach. He's actually coached sides in the when the Super Series was there. Paul Odera, welcome.
Wahome, thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's see, having this Super Series back for you, this time you've got a different role, but what does it bring back from the years when you were handling franchises back?
Well, first of all, let me make a correction. The tournament director is Absalom Juma. Yeah. I'm the high performance coordinator. Coach. So I think the question you've asked about how it was when I was coaching the franchises. I played in the first ever Super Series in 2003. That betrays my age almost immediately. But then I went in and then coached into it. It's a fantastic event because it gives the 15s program a platform that's just below test match rugby, which is the same as the national team, but also above club rugby. Because when you're bringing together 100 of the top rugby players in Kenya to play in a competitive event for a month, it then gives a good platform for them to stay sharp. It also gives a good platform for the selectors of the Simbas to also see which players they'd like to use.
Well, what would you say has been when the Super Series was there 10 years ago? We know there was a run-up to the 2015 World Cup. How did you see the Simba setup develop? Because the Super Series at that point was quite competitive. I think the Rhinos were the most successful then.
Yes, the Super Series had grown. You remember it went from 4 teams, yes, 100 players, then I think to 6 teams, where we then had franchise teams from outside Nairobi. Then we got teams from Tanzania. I think we then had 2 franchise teams from Uganda. So by the time the Super Series was being played about 10 years ago, it had developed into a regional franchise event, which is excellent. Because remember, if our neighbors are strong, we are also as strong. When your neighbors are not very strong, then it doesn't really work for you. So at that time, it was brilliant because then it had developed into East Africa. We're looking to get Zimbabwe in to bring in franchise teams. So sadly, when it stopped at that time, I think we've now had to go backwards and regroup to say and see how we can then build it up again. So that's why this year, it's only 4 teams. But the best thing about this year is the clubs have taken ownership of the franchises. Because before it used to be, that's a KRU event, and then their club events. But this year, the franchises have taken ownership of it. The chairman of the clubs are fully engaged, and with their support is how this Super Series has actually taken off.
Well, let's also talk about how, the composition of the franchises, because I can mention Lions, KCB, JKUAT, Black Blood, USIU, and the South Coast Pirates. The Buffaloes, you've got Kabras, Kisumu, Monks, Masinde Muliro, and Western Bulls. Cheetahs are the basically Oilers, Nakuru, Kabarak, University of Eldoret. And then you've got Rhinos, which is you've got Strathmore, Daystar, Mean Machine, and Mombasa. The thinking behind these combinations.
That's a good question. The thinking, well, first we then had to look at the Kenya Cup standings from last year, not this year. So the top 4 Kenya Cup teams immediately formed the core teams of each franchise. So you'll see Cabras forming the core, one franchise, KCB, and then you have Queens and I think it was Strathmore.
In Strathmore, yes.
Yes. So now those were the core from last year. So into next year, of course, it will be different. So after that, then we looked at geographical considerations. Then we also had to look at, which teams do you put with which team, because you can't put KU to play with the team in Western Kenya. Yes. And then after that was done, then is when we got into what makes up which franchise teams. It's not been easy. Behind the scenes, I'll tell you, there's been a lot of push and pull because it's something that has been lost for 10 years. But it's working in a way because the teams are then able to learn how to cooperate and how to manage. Then even the coaching staff, there had to be some agreement on which coach comes from which club. And then you will see that there are some dominant clubs. That's the reality. I think Cabras alone have 19 Simbas players.
Yes.
You see.
That's the situation at the moment.
That's the reality on the ground. But with high performance rugby, sometimes those are the sad realities. When I played in the first Super Series, I was at Queens, and Queens was the dominant club. I think we had Nakuru with us as well. They're traveling from a long way. I think, and USIU also in our franchise. You had 13 Queens players starting and maybe 2 or 3 from other clubs. So sometimes it's not always balanced. But what you'll find is, if we do this consistently every year, you're going to find the standards and levels of other clubs coming up and they'll get better players. So at some point you'll be able to get at least equitable representation from all the clubs.
Well, I know the conversation about equitable representation has been there, but the reality, the 2022-2023 Kenya Cup standings determined that, but the 2023-2024 Kenya Cup is a story by itself.
Yes.
You are either up there or down.
As you said, yes, you did.
And just taking a look at what we saw over the weekend, what we watched over the weekend, what's the impact now when it comes to team selections, where you find that, for example, we find a franchise saying, hey, how come we only have one player, but, or I'll use an example of the Lions where KCB are dominating.
Yes. It's not an easy conversation to have because everybody wants to be represented. However, what you've got to look at is this tournament is meant to be a platform to select the Kenya Simbas. So as much as we want to have equity, we've also got to take into cognizance the fact that the national coach and the national team setup also want to see players playing who they want to consider for the national team. So it's a very difficult balance to strike between having equity in selection, but also making sure that the best rugby players in Kenya are on the field at that time. So, Wahome, there's no easy answer to that. In fact, as we speak, there's still a lot of conversation going on. There's also the under-20s, don't forget.
Yes.
Chipu, who won in Zimbabwe. Some of those players as well, remember, preparing to go to Scotland in July. The coaches also want to see, can these boys play at a higher level, keep them sharp, keep them playing rugby that's going to be a lot harder than what they'll experience in Scotland. So that's also another consideration. So you can imagine, let's go back to Cabras. They have 29 Simbas and Chipu players. So then what happens to players from Kisumu who want to say, look, can I put my hand up and get selected for the national team? So it's not an easy conversation to have, but it's one that I think we'll be able to find a workable solution.
At times, team selection is always it's a coach's headache, and when one team is dominating, and stands out to be that way. Let's first of all take a look at what you saw over the weekend and some of the conversations that you'd want to have with the coaches. First, Cheetahs versus Buffaloes, and you saw, everyone says this was the surprise result.
Surprise result, possibly. The Cheetahs will tell you it was not a surprise result, of course. Buffaloes to the extent. But if you're looking at the team on paper, the Cheetahs were favourites to win based on the selection of the players that they had. So maybe Buffaloes may have a rethink because they played a very young team, but very exciting team. I think the fullback is the Chipu fullback as well, and he played. But the focus really as Super Series for the coaches was to try and support them with their communication. Verbal communication pre-match, the verbal communication at halftime, and the verbal communication post-match. So that's what we were supporting the coaches with, to see how they can support their players to get to play better. The Cheetahs played the conditions really well, but if you look at who they had at scrum half, on Samson Onsomu is still a very wise old head. And these conditions suited him perfectly because you couldn't really play an expansive, quick game. And by the time he was managing the game that well, they were able to get into the right places on the field and play.
Well, talking about the conditions, just take a look at your screen, and those were the conditions at the RFUA grounds. And you'd think that you'd be watching rugby someplace in England when it's wet, rather than the Southern Hemisphere rugby, which tends to be flowing. And one of the things that you'd like, I know you'll have conversations with, the four coaches of the franchises, is adaptation to maybe these conditions like this.
Exactly. And Wahome, you've asked the right question, because we've got to learn to play in every condition. We had to take the decision before the game to have uncontested scrums because it was so muddy, as you can see on the screen. And the problem was going to be that if we had contested scrums, you can imagine 800 kilos on 800 kilos with little traction on the ground. So suddenly, if the scrum went down, you'd have a pressure of almost 1,000 kilos going onto the front rows. So the risk, the injury risk was very high. So in consultation with Dr. Wimbo, the chief medical officer, and the referees, and the tournament director, Absalom Juma, then we said, right, uncontested scrums, and thankfully we came through unscathed. But we've got to learn to play in such conditions. And sometimes that has been the Achilles heel of the Simbas, and to a lesser extent the Sevens, but especially the Simbas. When we've got somewhere and suddenly the conditions are not what we're used to, we are not able to adapt. So it was good to see the players playing in such conditions.
Lions against Rhinos, 29-5 it ended. Lions under Oliver Mangeni. What was the main thing that you picked up from this franchise?
One, what I picked up from the Lions selection is they had a very settled build-up to this. Their opponents didn't have that. I think there's a time they went to train. It had rained so hard. They were training at Strathmore, but there was the river that had overflown, so they couldn't train for an hour. They were also looking for grounds on where to train, and that has proved challenging. But Mangeni's team, Oliver, I think they were settled. They did the selection early, and then they were able to get in sessions there. So it showed. They also played quite a number of Simbas players. So you could see the experience and you could see the quality of play that they brought in. But, it was match day one. So let's see how it goes in Nakuru. If the weather is better and if the ground is better, that could change the dynamics. how it goes.
Well, the advantage of Nakuru is that they've got 2 pitches on 1 ground. Let's see how they work around them, because I know they would love the noise. The other one that I would like, that everyone's having conversations about is we're building up to around June when, the Simbas will have to be in action one way or another. And from the lessons learned from the previous Rugby Africa Cup competition, you have this, everyone's been talking about some growth in the set piece play, say lineouts and the scrums. What are the lessons that, after you analyze all the data, you want to hand back?
Well, this weekend was difficult because first the scrums are uncontested.
Yes.
Lineouts, I'd say, are still a challenge for us even under these conditions because we'll have to still learn how to throw or jump if it's muddy or if it's wet. But set pieces, I know Jerome Powert and his team have really focused on, because if you don't have your set piece in 15-a-side rugby, you can't compete it. Yeah, and it becomes very difficult. You saw it with Chipu when they had a solid scrum. They were able to put Zimbabwe under pressure, and because of that, they built on that as a platform. And that is something that I think is the focus for Super Series as well, looking at the set pieces. The national team coaches are working very closely with all the franchises to bring down the pattern that is being used at the Simbas down to each of the franchise teams. I think the set piece coaches there are also looking to see what they can bring in terms of their technical know-how.
The other one is also talking about, the conditioning of the players and their fitness. How have you been working, especially with those who are in the Simba setup, to ensure that they're in the right condition all the time?
Well, I know there was a calibration camp in February. I think there was one camp then, which was done. The good thing is we're just coming out of Kenya Cup and having played 2 rounds of the Enterprise Cup. So the players are still fit, which really helps. I think there's some long-term injuries that are being monitored. The conditioning, the SNC people at the Simbas, I think, are also looking to see how they can support a lot of the franchises in keeping them fit. Once you've already started a competition like this, really it's about maintenance, and it's about maintaining the levels of condition, the strength, the power, and whatever gains that you've made. So making any meaningful gains, because this is a very intense tournament. It's 4 weeks, every weekend, bang, 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 and then we're done. So that'll be difficult. But I know the SNC coaches from the Simbas are working closely with the franchise coaches to monitor and to make sure that players who are potentially going to be in the Simbas or already part of the Simbas wider squad are kept fit.
Well, development is very important, and with the return of this, there is something you mentioned right at the start. The previous Super Series had heavy sponsorship. Every franchise would be tied to a sponsorship partner, so they would carry that name. But this time round, I know the Kenya Rugby Union pulling off this, not any major title sponsorship. The thing is, how have clubs taken ownership of this? Because, for example, we saw KCB take full ownership of the Lions.
Yes. Cabras have come in as well. Menengai, Oilers have come in. I think we've got to thank that group of companies. Water through Aquamist. So there's actually a lot of sponsorship that has come in. It's not been in cash, but it's helped to really reduce a lot of costs. Transport, for example, has been covered by some of the main clubs. Because to bring these teams from Western Kenya,
from Kakamega and Kisumu,
and then from Nakuru as well, that's a big cost when you're considering it's a team. But these main clubs have come in. KCB have come in, Cabras have come in, Menengai have come in and said, no, not a problem, we'll cover that. Even accommodation has been covered by some of these clubs. So actually the main sponsors of each of these franchises this year are actually those main clubs who've taken. That's why I told you, if they did not take ownership of this series this year, it would have been very difficult to hold because cash flows are important when you're holding a tournament of such a magnitude. But the club chairman and the franchise chairman, to their credit, have just sat down and said, right, Super Series must happen, and we are going to see how much we can support it. So that has been good.
Looking at it, and what were the vibes from the players and the coaches, and what you would want to be looking at next week when you travel to Nakuru, and the week after when you travel to Kakamega before coming back to Nairobi? I hope the pitch by then will have regenerated.
Yes, I mean, you know, you can only control what you're in control of. And we're not in control of the elements, but of course we're in control of making sure the condition of the pitch is up to an acceptable standard. Looking forward to this coming weekend. So every week with the coaches, well, let's look at high performance first, because high performance in a way has, we look at different elements. There's the match officials. What we're really trying to do is to develop synergy between match officials and the coaches. Because always there's this finger pointing when a match has ended, ref did this, ref did that. What we're trying to do is to try and get a good working relationship between the match officials and the coaches. So if they're working together, then the players will develop and the game is even better. The second thing we'll try and focus on with the coaches is their leadership. And in terms of focusing on individual players and supporting individual players. Because sometimes as a coach, it's easy to just treat the team as a blanket. Yet Wahome is very different from Paul Odera. Yeah. And what you might tell Paul and what you might tell Wahome will work for Paul, not work for Wahome. So maybe those are some of the things we'll try and get the coaches maybe to begin to understand their players as individuals, to try and see how they can play. Some played well last Saturday, some did not play as well. So how do you deal with that? So that's the work we're going to try and focus on going into match day 2. All right.
Paul Odera, he is the high performance chief at the Rugby Super Series. Let's take a short break from this conversation on the Super Series and move over to the Boulevard Hotel in Nairobi, where we've got the AUB Media Summit on Climate Change. KBC, as a host member of the AUB, the host broadcaster, and speaking right now is our acting managing director, Mr. Paul Masharia.
Are not only environmental but also economic, with our economy experiencing an annual loss of at least 5% of GDP due to these impacts. However, despite these challenges, there is hope. The media plays a crucial role in raising awareness and facilitating action on climate change through objective reporting and clear communication of weather forecast and early warning information. We can empower communities to mitigate the impacts of climate change and build resilience. Furthermore, regional and international cooperation is essential in addressing climate change. We must work together across borders and sectors to implement effective solutions and share knowledge and resources. Kenya's media is ready to collaborate with our global partners to tackle this urgent issue. Innovation and technology also play a vital role in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation efforts. From renewable energy solutions to climate-smart agriculture practices, innovative technologies are essential in building a sustainable future. Community engagement is another critical aspect of climate action. Local communities must be involved in decision-making process and be empowered to implement sustainable practices that promote resilience and adaptation. Moreover, youth engagement is paramount. Young people are not just the leaders of tomorrow, they are the leaders of today. We must listen to their voices, support their initiatives, and harness their energy and creativity in the fight against climate change. Policy advocacy is also crucial. We must advocate policy changes and supportive regulatory frameworks that promote sustainable development and address the root cause of climate change. In conclusion, I urge the media to rise to the challenge and serve as a bridge between scientists and the public, providing clear and accurate information to empower individuals and communities to make informed choices. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. As the MD KBC, it's important for me to also let you know that we are live on KBC TV. We are live on YouTube. So you can always alert those who are not here with us to be able to follow this live on KBC. So I'll be inviting our next speaker. Allow me to now invite Gregor Jaka, who is the CEO of the African Union of Broadcasting. Welcome. Makofi. That is clap.